time to meet probably the only person in the world who's combined Harvard plus Johns Hopkins in economics and ambulatory anesthesia and psychedelics, and still somehow seems quite relatable. Dr. Karim Ladha is a research powerhouse with over 16 million in grant funding, more than 150 publications. He's basically a unicorn who wears scrubs, and he's here to talk to us about whether so-called magic mushrooms might help with chronic pain. And let's be honest, if there's anyone who's going to help you responsibly dose that with science and curiosity, it's Karim. Please welcome Dr. Karim Ladha.
To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. Now, while you may have heard the word psychedelic before, what you may not know is its Canadian origins. So Dr. Humphrey Osmond was a psychiatrist who moved from the UK to Saskatchewan, and he was interested in studying LSD. If you've ever been to Saskatchewan, this sort of makes sense. But what he wanted to do is give patients with alcohol use disorder LSD to instill fear and get them to stop using alcohol. A weird hypothesis, but he went ahead. He gave the LSD, and instead he witnessed very dramatic reactions from his patients. He wanted to figure out a word to describe what they were experiencing. So he began writing rhymes with his friend Aldous Huxley, an American author, and he came up with this rhyme with the word psychedelic. It stems from the Greek word psyche, to mean mind or spirit, and delun, to mean to show. Today, psychedelics mean any class of medication or substance that causes a change in mood, perception, or cognition. But if you think about it, that applies to a lot of drugs. And as an anesthesiologist, I have a whole drawer full of medications that can change your consciousness. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, it's important to understand that, as we've learned in Dr. Richardson's talk, a lot of the things we do predate Western medicine. These drugs, plants, compounds have been used for thousands of years by humans, both as therapies but also in spiritual ceremonies. The modern psychedelic era, though, begins in Switzerland when Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD and accidentally took it right before going on a very famous bike ride on his way home. In the 1960s, psychedelics began being used as recreational substances. And pretty soon they were blamed for an anti-government movement, and they quickly became Schedule I drugs. Now, there has been a reemergence of psychedelics, particularly two, MDMA and psilocybin. And you can't turn on Netflix, open a magazine, or go to social media without seeing some headline like this, whether it be a CEO trying to get a leadership edge, someone trying to kill Alzheimer's disease or long COVID, and even maybe chronic pain. But the question for us is, how can these substances be used towards chronic pain? It's something that patients are asking, it's something that providers are asking, it's something that policymakers want to know. Are these substances truly a panacea? Can they solve our problem? Or are they harmful, and should we stay away? Well, as a scientist, our first reaction to do anything when we have a question is to do a review of the literature. And so my colleague Akash Goel and I, what we did is we looked at all the data out there that is published on psychedelics and chronic pain. And we found a lot of articles, but it came down to 20 studies. And they looked at things like migraines, headaches, phantom limb pain, cancer pain. The two most common drugs studied were LSD and psilocybin. But there was only one randomized controlled trial of 10 patients, meaning that the quality of evidence that we typically use to make decisions in medicine was not there. And so we said, okay, you know what? Well, we know how to do a clinical trial. So let's go and do this. So we asked our patients, we went to our pain clinic and we interviewed them, and we said, would you be interested in participating in a trial on psychedelics? And what was interesting is 77% said yes, they were willing to participate. But what was more surprising is that 15 of the 26 had already tried a psychedelic to help with their pain. To us, this meant that we needed to move and move fast because our patients needed the data. One of the things we struggled with, though, when we were designing our trial is what is an adequate control? And so we turned to the previous literature again. And so there's no shortage of psychedelic-related trials in the mental health space. People have been using psilocybin to study depression for some years. And so if you do research, you'll recognize some of the fonts from these examples. They're from journals like the New England Journal, JAMA, Lancet, more prestigious journals than I'll ever publish in. But when they looked at psychedelics, they did something interesting. They randomized patients to either getting psilocybin at 25 milligrams, which will make you hallucinate for 6 to 8 hours, or give you a dose of 1 milligram, which is essentially inert. And so you had patients who were supposed to be blinded to their allocation. They weren't supposed to know what they got. And so one group went in and they sat with 2 therapists and they hallucinated for 6 to 8 hours. The other group took the pill, which was at 1 milligram, and had an awkward 6 to 8 hours with 2 therapists, wondering when something was going to happen. And so it's no surprise that a lot of these trials were positive. And this is one of the reasons why MDMA was not approved by the FDA. And so we thought and we said, well, can we do something better? And so we looked and we found these interesting articles. And so what people have done in the past is they've actually given people dextromethorphan, which is the active ingredient in cough syrup. And what they found is that if you give high-dose dextromethorphan, you can make someone hallucinate for 6 to 8 hours, and sometimes people can't tell whether they're getting a classical psychedelic or cough syrup. And so with that was born the Peace Pain Study. So we have funding from CIHR to do this pilot. We're looking at 30 patients with neuropathic pain, and we're randomizing them to either getting psilocybin or dextromethorphan. Both groups will get psychotherapy, and this trial is currently ongoing and recruiting actively right now. So I often get asked why I'm interested or why I do this, and I think it's important to understand why I'm excited. So the first thing is the armamentarium of a pain physician is quite limited. I am tired and fed up of seeing patients who have to resort to getting medical assistance and dying because we simply do not have the tools to help them. And so if something shows promise and the preliminary data suggests that there is plausibility, we should do everything to pursue this. This is not a new drug. I don't need billions of dollars or decades. We can get this from Queen Street. But I think the other important thing, and Dr. Cottarella mentioned this in his talk, is it's not the same old just giving someone a pill anymore. Instead, integral to psychedelics is the therapy part. And even in a multidisciplinary clinic, in a pain clinic, we sometimes operate in silos. But with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, we simply cannot do that. You need both the biologic and the psychologic. But I think it's important that we be cautious with this. We've made mistakes in the past with opioids, with cannabis, saying that things are simply too safe. It's easy to fall back on the fact that these substances have been around for thousands of years to say that nothing can go wrong. We've done trials, and while there have been no adverse events, it's important to note that these studies excluded many patients that we would see in our pain clinic. And so, it's important that we don't deny that adverse events can happen. I can't think of any drug that doesn't have a negative side effect. But instead, we have to acknowledge it and understand it to prevent it from happening in our patients. The other concern is scalability. I love working with my psychologists. I wish I could clone them, but there's simply not enough of this to make this widespread. It is incredibly hard for me to see a chronic pain patient and get them seen by a psychologist, let alone have 2 sitting with them for 6 to 8 hours during a session, not to mention the before and after. One of the things we're working on at Women's College with my colleague Nilesh Sonaji, who's in the back, is the idea of group-assisted psychotherapy. And can we do this in a more efficient manner? And then finally, the one thing that I think is really interesting is I presented this trial to someone who does a lot of work in psychedelics, And they said, well, your control is too good. And I said, well, what do you mean? I need a good control. That's what a clinical trial is. Don't I want something that's going to be psychoactive? And what they said to me sort of gave me pause. And it makes me think. So when we do this work, we can give someone ketamine. We can give someone psilocybin. We can give someone MDMA. We can even do breath work to induce an altered state of consciousness. And so what does it mean when we have these techniques and substances that work on completely different mechanisms of action, but they all seem to treat the same disease? And is it simply that we're altering someone's consciousness and that's why they're getting a benefit, or is it the drug itself? But I think it's an important question that makes us think about chronic pain and how we treat it. And so I want to leave you with this slide, and this is something I talk about a lot. So this is something called the Gartner Hype Cycle. The Gartner Group is a consulting company, and as you know, consulting companies charge a lot of money to apply the same framework over and over again to different problems. And so I'm going to pretend I'm a consultant today. And so the Gartner Hype Cycle was initially developed to describe new and emerging technologies. But it actually aptly describes what happens for chronic pain interventions as well. And so what happens is you have an innovation trigger, you get this peak of inflated expectations, you go through down to this trough of disillusionment, you climb the slope of enlightenment to the plateau of productivity. And if we think about things that we have today, so opioids, I think we're finally at a place with opioids where we say that there's a role for them, we understand how to use them, we're on the plateau of productivity. Cannabis, if you remember, millions of dollars were given to researchers to do studies on pain in cannabis. Now, you can't find any. We're at the trough of disillusionment. And so for psychedelics, right now we are at the peak of inflated expectations. And what is important is that as we as a scientific community and chronic pain providers and patients, that we maintain our impartiality, we keep our nuance so that we can understand these things and figure out what it is. And through research, we can get to this plateau of productivity. I'm not saying don't be hopeful. I'm not saying don't be excited. But if we do the studies correctly, we'll do right by our patients and make sure that everybody stays safe and has a good time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ladha. There is a few questions that came in online, and we're just going to put the QR code back up. And so I thought this was a good one for you. So psychedelics and psilocybin in particular is very serotonin kind of mechanism of action. So is there any expectation this will be any different to the other serotonin drugs we have in the market?
Yeah, I mean, the other serotonin drugs on the market don't necessarily make you hallucinate for 6 to 8 hours. So I think that's one of the key things that we have to figure out is it truly a serotonin effect or is it something else? And they've been studies where they've looked at brain networks and functional connectivity. I'm not a neuroscientist, so apologies to anyone who is. But I think what we truly do not understand is how these drugs work, and as a class and even individually, and that's something we need to focus on more.
Thank you, sir.